Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Accelerate webinar series hosted by the University of Denver's Daniels College of Business Executive Education Program. I'm David Worley, Executive Director, and I'll be your host today. The Accelerate webinar series is designed to help you accelerate your capacity to deliver results for your organization. Today's webinar will be roughly 25 minutes, and we will start with a brief presentation from our faculty and then move to questions and answers towards the end. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we can live, and if we don't get to yours, we will record answers to your question and include that in our email follow-up to you. At the bottom of your screen, you will find a question and answer icon, Q&A, down at the bottom. Feel free to submit a question whenever you see fit. For this fifth installment of our series, we are happy to welcome Allie Boyd. Allie has been a faculty member at Daniels for 5 years and is currently Assistant Professor of the Practice and Director of Leadership and Professional Development. She is a longtime executive coach, having worked with many interesting clients, including Google, Dell, Intel, McKinsey, Amazon, and the U.S. Foreign Service. Importantly for Daniels Exec Ed, she, along with Scott McLagan, is one of the core faculty for our award-winning Denver Leadership Experience. This program won the 2019 award for the best leadership program in North America, as judged by executive education professionals. Allie is known for her insightful feedback to students and colleagues and her expertise around bringing about people's best performing professional selves. You are all in for a treat in hearing a truly fantastic coach, mentor, and teacher. Allie, thanks for being with us.
Oh, David, thank you so much for such a warm introduction. I am so happy to be with you all today. It's a huge treat to get to spend a little bit of time with you all talking about something that is really close to my heart. As David said, it's squarely in the center of my practice, which is around coaching. So today what I want to do is talk about coaching as a catalyst, thinking about optimizing our conversations for performance, engagement, and growth. So as we get started, what I want to invite you to do is get, if you've got a piece of paper, you've got a sticky note, something to write with, think about something in your life, someone in your life who you might consider is a candidate for a coaching conversation. So this could be someone personally, it could be someone at home, given the context all of us are in our quarantine lives, it could be someone in your professional life and your work. But begin to think about someone with whom you would like to engage, that you think about, you have some ideas about their performance, about their development, about their growth. So a conversation that you think you might like to have in that domain. And we're going to talk a little bit about carrying your own example in your head as we go through the slides, talking about this concept of coaching as something that is a catalyst for supporting people's development and their performance and their continued growth. So get your example going in your mind, think about what that might look like for you, and we'll go ahead and jump right in. So when I think about powerful coaching conversations, there's really 3 components to a coaching conversation that I want to touch on today. First is to get really clear on your why. So first, what you want to think about is you're going to enter into a conversation, you want to think about what would success look like here. So going back to that example that you have in your head, and we'll dive into each of these as we go in turn, but what would the outcome be that would be an outcome you'd really like to see happen? Second, for a powerful coaching conversation is to think in levels. So we're going to talk about kind of what's the anatomy of every conversation we have in life, personal, work, and otherwise, and to begin to think in levels in the context of that conversation. Third piece of a powerful coaching conversation is to shift your mindset so that you can begin to trigger generative thinking in the person that you're interacting with or in the context you're in. So 3 components to a powerful coaching conversation. And first, we want to turn to getting clear on your why. So as you bring to mind the context you're using as an example, or you're just thinking in general, the first step to getting prepared to having any kind of conversation for development or growth is really to get clear on what the outcome would be that you would like to see happen. So what makes this conversation important to have? What are you hoping to accomplish through having this conversation? How could I be an agent of growth or transformation? How can I be thinking about what the kind of bullseye success would look like for this conversation? If you haven't already, something you want to begin to get curious about at this very first step is, have I really asked myself what this person is up against? So have I really gotten into kind of the world through their eyes? If I've gotten inside and gotten curious about what their perspective is, do I know what matters most to this person? So step one, before we go in with an objective to create change, we want to see, to sort of take the old adage of walk a mile in that man's shoes. So have you very first off considered what it would look like from their perspective? We know that as a starting point, when we think about supporting people's growth, development, creating any kind of a change, including around performance, the most important thing to do is to go in with an intention of discovery, with an intention of understanding them, rather than going in with our agenda of how we think things should be. So step one, get clear on your why, get clear on how you're approaching the conversation and what success would look like if it were to be a successful intervention or a successful conversation. Okay, step two in powerful coaching conversations is to think in levels and think through the anatomy of a conversation through all of its component levels. So this is some great work that was done out of Harvard back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It's a model that's been applied all over the world in really challenging negotiations, places where there's difficult conversations that need to be had. And it's a model that I find really useful for thinking through mentally what's going on in every conversation we have. So what there is to understand about this model is there's always 3 levels of a conversation happening. And we'll go through each of them in turn. The first is the what's happening level. So this is just very simply what's here, what's going on, what are the facts, what's happening between us, what's the story. This is the domain where most of us focus most of our attention in any conversation we're having. The second layer down is the feelings layer. The feelings layer is how is each of us feeling about this? And the third layer, and this is really what tends to be most invisible to us, but is also the most critical in terms of generating powerful conversations, is the identity layer. So what's at stake here for us each as humans? So we'll go into them layer by layer. We'll do a quick overview. Level 1, this is the what's happening conversation. And of course we know that that our human perception is enormously varied and very unique to each of us. So in any situation, any context that we're in, there's always, of course, 2 sides to the story at least, or multiple perspectives on what's true here, what's happening. We know that we take in the world through a variety of different filters. And so our unique experience of a situation is going to have a certain interpretation on it. One of the first things to do in this first layer of conversation is get really curious about what do I see here? And really importantly, what might that person be experiencing or seeing? Just at the very level of what's happening here. What's the territory we're actually in? The second layer of every conversation is always the feelings layer. And the feelings layer has to do with the emotional quality of how we're coming to a conversation. So this could be that, there's frustration, there's annoyance, there's a feeling of worry or being stuck, there might be excitement. Always some kind of emotional tone accompanies what's happening to us at that first layer. Now, this is a point where a lot of people say, but wait, do we really have to talk about feelings? Because isn't this work? Isn't this a professional context? I thought we had to leave all that at the door. And here's the upshot of that answer. Human beings are leaky. We are leaky. And so whether or not we acknowledge feelings being there, they're there. And if we don't acknowledge them, then what often happens is they come out in unhelpful and unproductive ways. So just like the lava that leaks out at cracks in the volcano, or sometimes blows the top off, feelings are here. And so acknowledging them, acknowledging that those are here helps us move through that in a way that is most helpful. The third layer of every conversation is the identity conversation. And the identity is really about what's at stake for us as human beings. We all carry this around with us through our lives, through our professional lives, through our home lives, and it's always here. And this has to do with some of the core questions around some fundamental attributes of human needs. Do I belong here? Am I loved or am I lovable? Am I competent? Am I respected? Am I important in this system? Am I heard? Am I counted? The level of the identity is usually where we actually don't acknowledge that that's happening, that that's operative, and it's where people really dig in their heels. Because if identity is threatened, people have very little capacity or ability to engage in any of the other levels of the conversation. So think in levels. This is the second important piece of the coaching conversation, knowing that even if it's invisible, all of the conversations are always there. There's always the 3 layers of every conversation we ever are having. Okay, so we've got 2 steps so far. We've gotten clear on the why. What would success look like here? Think in levels. Think about the anatomy of the conversation. This would be a good moment to just check in with the story or the opportunity that you're considering as we're traveling through this conversation together. Who's the person that you brought to mind when I first mentioned it, when we kind of came into the room together? Are you clear about what success would look like for that conversation? If not, it would bear spending some time getting clear about that. Doing the work of thinking about, both for me and for that person, what are the levels and what would be the perspective on those levels in that conversation? 2 important critical steps. The third and final step of thinking about generating a powerful conversation is really thinking about then you and your mindset and how to support the other person's brain to get into a generative thinking zone. So we'll go there next. First, getting you in a place where you're ready to have a generative and a positive conversation is to begin by setting your mindset for success. So coming in with an orientation towards genuine curiosity and coming in with that intention for discovery. So when we come in with an agenda, it has an impact on our conversation partner and an impact on our own brains. So seeing if you can engage in what Ed Schein from MIT calls humble inquiry, which is I'm coming in without an agenda, without an implicit desired answer. This, from a behavior perspective, would include listening first and probably listening more than you're speaking. So curiosity, listening, and a lot of humility about, I'm really here to learn. A key insight here for all of us is that when we come into any kind of a conversation and we have an objective of fixing, probably all of us have been on the receiving end of this at some point, it creates in our brain, at our brain level, a resistance. And what it does is it acts, our brains can't tell the difference between a physical threat and a social or a psychological threat. Our brains get activated and it generates a really powerful resistance. At an extreme level, it can be a fight, flight, or a freeze instinct. But even at a sort of a moderate level, what it does is it produces the possibility of a short-term corrective, but usually a response that's obligatory at best. So it's not a sustainable, long-term enduring change when someone's coming at us with a kind of a fix-it proposition. Instead, what do you do instead is we want to begin to invite people into an alternative version of the future. And I'll say what I mean by that. What we want to do is think about facilitating discovery and helping people align to a better version of their future selves. So rather than going in with a fix-it, we want to engage them in self-generating whatever kind of a solution is going to actually produce growth and development. So the way to do this is by anchoring people in their what's called their ideal selves and invite them into a vision of a more hopeful future. And I'll say a little bit what I mean by that. The questions we ask and the way we phrase things really matter in terms of the impact on people's brains. So to get people into the generative learning zone, we want to avoid invoking what's called the ought self. And the ought self, also something probably all of us have experienced in our lives many times, involves bringing us into a brain state where what we're looking for is, what should I be doing? What would be good for me? So here it's a great example kind of from the medical field. If a doctor says to you, even if the change that's desired is critical to maintaining your health, this particular method of generating change still is equally ineffective. So it might look like a doctor saying, you should quit smoking and take care of your health. You really ought to manage your weight better. You really ought to consider cutting down on the number of drinks you have per day. Many of us know that those things would be good for us and be helpful for us, but what it does is it puts us into a part of our brains that aligns with this kind of negative bias, where what we do is we go into a different zone of processing. An alternative to that is to invite people into a version of their ideal selves. This puts us into a different learning zone from a brain perspective and invites us into generating solutions and taking action, which of course results in much more kind of compliance, generative engagement. It's a whole different portion of your brain. So what this could sound like is, what would it look like if you were healthy and thriving? What first steps might you take? So just notice the difference of being in an ought self zone versus an ideal self zone, and what that does maybe to your brain when you hear those questions. And then think back to the example that you're playing with and what you might be able to do in terms of a pivot to invite someone towards an alternative desired future. There's lots of ways to play with this, of course, and there's no particular script that you need to follow, but what you can do is think about some best practices. So an invitation is a way to approach this kind of thing from a curiosity and a generative space. I'm wondering if we can talk about this. I'm wondering if we can check in about. Again, going back to remembering that identity level, always beginning by reassuring or validating the identity. I want you to know how much you mean around here. I want you to know how much the last 2 weeks during this crazy crisis, you have been the heartbeat of this team. I really just wanted to tell you how much your contributions have mattered and how much working on that report made a huge difference to us. You really dug in and pulled through. What we're doing there is we're setting the brain in a state where I can reduce my scan for threats and be more in a curiosity and engaged partnership zone. What this allows me to do then is to be in the collaborative space. And in the collaborative space, I'm going to be able to engage questions like, if this project were a huge success, what would it look like for you? What could we do that would be some first steps to get you there? In your best version of this job or this position or this project, what would be a good goal for you to tackle first? So see if you can play with the language and the framing, and really what the core thing is we're taking care of people's brains. We're coming in without pre-formulated answers, and we're inviting them into a different desired future state. And it harnesses a different level of creativity and thinking inside their own brains. So here we are. If we do a roundup, how do we think about coaching as a catalyst for performance, for engagement and growth? There's again those 3 components. First, get clear on your why. What would success look like here? Rather than coming in with a fixing mentality, which just invites resistance, can I figure out how I'm going to support getting internal motivation to generate growth and change? Really, probably my goal is in alignment with that. And if it's not, take another step back and consider, what would actually success look like here? And how can I get myself into that space? Second, remember that all conversations have 3 levels: the story piece around what's happening, the feelings piece, and the identity piece. Core to every conversation is to reassure the identity and set up the brain for learning and generating solutions. And third, get your own mindset ready to be curious, to be listening, to be coming in with humility around what might happen here, what you could learn and discover, and put the other person's brain in a space where they can be invited into their best future version of themselves.
Allie, wow, thank you.
Awesome. So I'd love to hear what's on people's minds and what we can answer by way of questions.
Yeah, so to the audience, if you want to ask a question, I'll remind you, you can go in through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pose it there. And like I said at the top, we'll try to answer what we can and get back to the rest of you after the live broadcast here. But I wanted to give you a kudo. Stephen Nostrand just said this is one of the best webinars he's ever been a part of. So thank you, Allie.
Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate that.
Way to go. I have a lead-off question for you that I having seen a lot of these Accelerate webinars, I have a hunch a lot of people are asking. You talked about the way that whether or not we want to acknowledge feelings or not, they're there and they're going to leak out. Yeah. What would be your advice for somebody who works with a supervisor or who have colleagues who don't think that feelings matter in the workplace? They don't think feelings matter in leadership, despite the fact that often those people are the very ones who leak profusely. So what is your advice in dealing with colleagues, bosses, subordinates, you name it, who don't really see feelings leaking?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is so common because again, that question comes up a lot for, different people who say, do we really have to talk about this? Aren't we in a professional environment? Do we have to have feelings count? So I think there's a couple of best practices or principles to think about, which is one, oftentimes people who are in the zone of not noticing they're leaking or noticing that feelings are a part of a context that's occurring, um, are simply not aware of their own feelings. So they may be in a place where they don't have very much access from an emotional intelligence perspective, to themselves, to what they're feeling, how they're impacting other people. So just to know that folks who are having a hard time acknowledging or recognizing or noticing that feelings are a part of a conversation or a context, it may simply be beyond their kind of known domain or their bandwidth. It might be something that they don't really have a very good idea about to start with. The second piece is, given that, so it may not be sort of intentional, but really more of a blind spot for people. Given that and knowing that that might be the case, then oftentimes, naming what's here from your own perspective can be really helpful. So, gosh, David, it seems like we're getting into a little bit of a tangle here. And I'm wondering if you're starting to feel frustrated. I know I'm having a hard time, right?
Yep.
Naming things in real time from my perspective and then checking it out. Because again, I have to acknowledge with humility, I might be wrong. So does that feel true to you? And, oh, you're not frustrated. Okay, great. Well, what is going on for you? Because that might help us actually get to the bottom of what we can do to move this forward.
Yeah.
So using that kind of framing and starting from a place of curiosity, and also acknowledging that person may have a blind spot around the fact that emotions are even here.
Yeah. Great answer. We got lots of questions. I'm going to select this one because I think it's a little bit different flavor than what we've talked about thus far. Erica Hodes asks, I'm curious how this might be adapted for different personalities. So can you talk about the differences there and coaching across personalities?
Yeah, what a great question, Erica. I would say that this is, to the extent that you really know your audience, you're always going to have kind of a leg up, right? So some people are really lead with their feelings, for example. Some people might kind of first come in it from a feelings domain and then need to be brought into a more analytical or cognitive domain. So if that were the case, and I were working with someone who was really a feelings-based person, I might start there or reassure or validate at that level. If I'm coming in and I'm going to be talking with someone for whom really they come in with a pretty, in our work, sometimes we use a particular tool, insights discovery, a high level of thinking, analysis, maybe a high degree of introversion, that domain isn't going to be as comfortable for them. I'd probably do a few things. One, signal as much in advance that I was going to try and have a conversation with them, or I had something I wanted to talk to them about, give them an ability to not be caught off guard by that, give them some sort of a headline around what that agenda might look like, and then not spend too much time in sort of an amorphous zone, but be pretty clear to get in, to get out, and then give them some space and time to come back to me to respond. So the more psychological safety you can create across all personality types, the better off you're going to be. But knowing your audience and adapting to what you know works best for them is always going to support you in having the best kind of conversation.
That's a great tip. I see a lot of people not recognize that they're being amorphous in difficult conversations. So yeah, so helpful. An anonymous attendee, I have a friend who, no, but honest to goodness, an anonymous attendee asked, how do you invite someone into their ideal self when they don't recognize that that's something that's necessary, or they have no idea, what that might be?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. That's a great question. And first of all, I would say a key to doing this well is to find language that's authentic to you. So on this call, on this webinar, I'm using language that feels like it would be natural for me. I might invite someone into, their ideal self, or say, hey, if you were going to tell me about your dream for this project or your dream for this next chapter of your life, what would that look like? Mm-hmm. For me and my personality and the way I talk, that doesn't seem too out of line for me. For others, that might feel a little bit beyond what's comfortable or what would seem native to you, and that's fine. So first, find the language that would feel right to you and make it fit in your own self. I would say that all humans all human brains are wired to get into this generative zone, this creative, imaginative zone. Many adults, sadly, have sort of lost some connection to that part of ourselves. But all of us have the ability and access to that when we're invited in a certain way.
Yeah.
So finding the language that works for you, and then for some people, you have to find out what's the different entry point that will work best.
Mhm.
So if you're in a place where there's been a real loss of trust, or someone is really stuck or really struggling in a particular role or function, it might be hard to find the kind of entry point into, uh, you know, if this became overnight your favorite job you've ever had, what would look different tomorrow?
Yeah.
And how could I be a part of that? What could we do? What would be a first step? I mean, again, it's going to have to be language that works for you, but finding what's the entry point in for that person, given where they are and who they are. But the core inquiry that I really appreciate is, how can I be engaging them to stretch into that desired future state? Because that's going to be the key move.
Yeah. Amazing. We've got lots of great questions coming in. And folks, just so you know, something that we've changed about the Accelerate series is in the follow-up email that we will send out, we've begun to record the Q&A so that you actually get Ali talking or our other faculties talking to your specific questions. So we will follow up with this slew of amazing questions that are being posed, but we're out of time. So Ali, thanks so much for being with us. It's been really amazing. You knocked it out of the park in terms of providing extraordinary insight and advice and just well-researched, well-grounded stuff in a really, really brief amount of time. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks everyone for attending. Good to be with you.
And to the attendees, if you like this webinar, please join us again next Thursday, May 14th, when Bo Staruzik will be teaching about team resiliency. On May 28th, we'll invite Amy Phillips to present on the importance of data visualization. You can find all of these dates, register, and see past webinars on our webpage. You can find that by Googling the Accelerate webinar series at the Daniels College of Business. For those of you who might be interested, as I mentioned earlier, Ali teaches in the Denver Leadership Experience, and we're now taking registrations for all of our outstanding leadership programs, which will run this fall. You can find out more information on our executive education website. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We hope you gained new insight that will accelerate your impact in your community, your organization, and the world. From the University of Denver, Daniels College of Business Executive Education Program, we look forward to seeing you again on the Accelerate webinar series. Thanks for being with us.